All right, so we'll go ahead and dive into the second lesson learned, which, like Chris said, we're going to spend a little bit more time on because it's something that we felt like we could have improved on. And looking back, we have some key takeaways from how to learn from this moving forward with DSP projects. So it is really important to know your sites and what their management history is. And so we think that's important to just be very thorough in finding out all you can about your sites, not just what's currently out there, but what has historically been done on that site. Because if the goal of the project is to assess management, then it's really important to know what management was actually applied in the past. And so we think that it's really important to have ongoing conversations and engagement with the farmers and with people like Corey, who know really well, what the management is out there and have been working on these farms for a long time. That's just a key part of being able to obtain that knowledge about the DSP sites. And so the thing is, spending all that time with the farmers, getting all that management information, that means that you're going to be investing a lot of time in this part of the project. It's really time consuming. And I know that Carl has been spending a lot of time doing this on another, not to get into that too much, but in the next DSP project that we've been working on, we've been trying to make sure this happens, that, we get a lot of that information up front, and he can speak to the fact that it just takes a lot of time to do that. And so that's kind of the overall idea of this lesson learned. And in the Valley, like I said, we didn't do as good as we could have with this one. And so we didn't really ask enough questions and collect enough information. And I think Chris hit on this before, but there wasn't an agronomist or like a grazing specialist out there helping to pre-screen fields and to evaluate the management out there. Alexandra and Chris and them were using what the national protocol and procedure gave them to collect, and that's what they were basing us off of. And so because of that, we didn't fully recognize, we didn't fully look into and research or account for what we're going to call this layer cake of inherent and dynamic factors. So we're going to get into that here in the next slides of what this layer cake is. And it's pretty much a model to look at these management histories of these sites. And it's really important because it can influence the results that we get from these soil health assessments. And it can make it really difficult to isolate the impact of the past management of these sites. And so we're going to, like I said, we're going to dig into that a little bit more. But the other big takeaway of what we did in the Valley is that we didn't budget enough time to do this thoroughly. And like Alexandra said, there were other complications. She was going on detail in Wyoming. It was kind of a push to get all of this done. And so, that was one of the main reasons that this didn't happen like maybe it should have. But with that, we're going to go ahead and get into what this layer cake of factors are that can influence soil health assessment. And so the term layer cake, we're going to use it as a conceptual model, and it's going to emphasize some of these hard to separate factors that can influence our soil health assessments and measurements. And just a reminder of like what models really are, it's just to help try to simplify our understanding and simplify this really complex idea and concepts that we're going to present to you. So hopefully it'll help clarify things for you and not confuse you more, but I will definitely give a chance to ask questions once we go through this model. But hopefully it's able to clarify what we're talking about with our management history. So we're going to build this table up. So we're about this table as kind of our cake, and we're going to be adding layers to it. And so this is where we started with this project. Our hypothesis was, we think that these near-term past managements can have a major influence on soil function and assessment results. So when we talk about near-term past management, you can see here, we're talking about years to decades. And so we have our time frame here. And then, well, what category of factor is this? And so this is anthropogenic, dynamic properties that, this falls into here. And so we're going to build that. And so like Carl brought just a minute ago, the other factor that we have in this cake is knowing the genetic or inherent factors like soil type, because they can have a really big influence on our results. So when we're talking about, what the genetic and inherent properties are, we're talking about, what soil formation factors were present here, taking into account, parent material, climate, topography, vegetation, time. So just taking into account pretty much the soil series, the soil type, which is, of course, looking back in geologic past time frame. So we were looking at really long ago, and then we were looking at years to decades. And that is really what our model was for this project. And so it was just this 2-layer model, and it's very essential to the DSP project concept. It's saying, okay, we're going to find sites with the same inherent properties so that we can isolate and assess the influence of this near-term management. But what we found through this is that there are additional layers to consider besides just these 2 layers. And so we're going to go through those a little bit to help break down and walk through what are some of the other factors that we should be considering besides this near-term past management and the genetic or inherent properties of these sites. So the first one that we're going to add is the long-term past. So we've split it up into these 2 categories to help clarify what we're talking about when we talk about our management history, because the impact of management doesn't just depend on what happened years to decades ago in the near-term past, but also the long-term past. So what happened decades to centuries ago. So for example, if we have tillage for the past 10 years on 2 sites, but prior to that, one of them spent 40 years in sod and one of them was in being cropped. That is important and that matters, and it's something that we need to account for as one of our factors. So the 4th layer, or not the 4th layer, but the next thing that we're going to add to that is saying, okay, for our management history, the impact of management also depends on, how long was this management applied. So it's knowing whether the site was in tillage for 10 years or 50 years. Was it in sod for 40 years or 200 years? So the duration is an important factor to consider when we think about management. And so is the depth, because the impact of management on soil function depends on the depth below the surface that you're looking at. So in general, we know that management influence decreases with sampling depth. So the deeper you go, the less likely it is that the soil there was influenced by what's going on management-wise. And so that's really important to consider too when you're thinking about your management. The next one is climate. And so the impact of the local climate and the microclimate are important to consider because, if you have a Frederick soil up here in the valley, but then you have a Frederick soil down, I think, down in Lee County or down somewhere else, there's going to be different factors, different rainfall that will make the management have different impacts. And so, for example, tillage is going to have a greater impact if there's higher rainfall in that area, even though it may be the same soil type. They'll have weathered differently due to the climate. So the other factor, last factor that we're going to add here is topography. And so the impact of what management's going on depends on the site topography and the microtopography. So thinking about the things like aspect and slope, because if you have tillage on flat ground, it's going to have a much different effect than if you have tillage on a steep slope. And so we want to make sure we're taking that into account. And I will just say that the DSP protocol that was a part of it that Alexandra and Chris and them were looking at when they were out there was, slope and aspect. But it's an important thing to include. So now we're going to add another layer here, and that is the very near-term past events. So these are things that happen days to months prior to when you're out there sampling. And Alexandra hit on this a little bit. Here you can see that it can be climatic or anthropogenic. So for example, recent weather events. What if we had a drought for the past 2 months before we go out there to sample? Or, what if the farmer just tilled last week in a tilled system? How is that going to influence our assessment results? And when we're trying to look at soil function, what do these things that just occurred, how do they impact what we're going to be looking at and measuring out in the field? So we added that too, because we think it's important to consider. So like, for example, I was going to show you some pictures of trying to get the bulk density slide hammer into the ground in extreme drought conditions, or trying to pound the infiltration ring in the ground when the soil was so dry And there's Alexander. They're trying to, dig our mini pits out there. So it made for a little bit more difficult work, but it's definitely something that should be taken into account, especially because with some of our measurements, for example, like our biologic measurements, the reason we, like to use them is because they're sensitive to changes. And so Alan might be able, like Dr. Franzlers might be able to speak to this more, but some of the assessments are really influenced more by the near-term past management, and some aren't influenced as much. And so it's an important thing to take into account, because some of them, like I said, the sensitivity does vary among the assessments. And so this is our complete model now, our layer cake model. It's just here to try to help conceptualize and understand what we're talking about when we're talking about these factors that will influence our DSP project design, the sites that we select, and our sampling protocol, when we sample. So it's really important, we think, to understand this when you're thinking about your DSP project design. So now we're going to think about, what does this mean for our project design? And so if we want to rigorously investigate how these differences in near-term past management here are influencing soil function, using, whatever assessment methods we decide we want to use, then it's really important that we hold all of these other factors constant, or at least account for them when we're designing our project. And so, yes, so that is the full model now, and that's how we think it plays into our DSP project design. And so now we're going to talk about, what does this look like in the real world? What does this mean when we're actually out in the field doing this work? And so I'm just going to go through this hypothetical example. So let's just say we have 2 sites for a Pasture DSP project. So we have field A, which is going to be our, poor management, it's overstocked, we do continuous grazing. We have field B, which is our, management intensive rotational grazing. And we know that both of these fields have been under these 2 systems of management for about 25 years. So that's our near-term past management. And, we had our soil scientists out there thoroughly investigating, making sure it's the same soil type, same slope, and that they match in both of these fields. And we also know that the farmers have given us, some reliable, detailed management information for each of the fields for the past 25 years. We know them, we know we can trust what they're telling us. So it sounds like really good candidates for this DSP project based on what we have collected so far. But we have to think about all of these other factors that we don't know. We don't know what happened in the last 90 days or recent events. What about the weather and management over the past 90 days? We also don't know anything about the long-term past management. So what happened 25 to 50 years ago? What happened 50 to 100 years ago or before that? And so, we need to be asking, what about management that occurred over 25 years ago? So long-term past management. And so we can say, okay, we get this information and we know that for the past 25 to 50 years, both of these were overstocked continuous grazing. And then we know that prior to that, field A was under, continuously grazing, but moderately stocked, not as many cattle out there. Whereas field B was under annual cropping system that used intensive tillage. And so knowing that background now, knowing the longer term history, we need to take that into consideration and think about, is this site a good candidate if we're trying to tease out the differences between this near-term past management up here? Does this give us a good setup to be able to isolate the effects of the near-term past management or not? So hopefully that gives you a little better idea of what was going on with how this model applies. And so we also need to, I haven't gone over this yet, we also need to take into account what happened over the past 90 days. So say we find out that in field A, even though it's typically overstocked with continuous grazing, for the past 90 days, it's been underutilized and there's high biomass accumulation. They just didn't put the cows, maybe they were at another farm or another field. And so there's high biomass accumulation there. Whereas in field B, it was actually recently hayed and had moderate regrowth. So, that could influence some of the assessments that we're doing out in the field. And so it just makes this comparison that may have originally seemed really promising seem like maybe we need to keep looking and find other sites at this point. So to kind of wrap this up and try to tie it all together, it's really important to know your sites and to know the management histories and to really consider all the factors that we just talked about. So to find good sites, we need to be able to isolate the impact of our near-term past management. And we need to make sure that we're understanding and accounting for, like we just went through, all of those factors that we shared in that layer cake model.
Hey, Lydia.
Yes.
When you're done with this slide, I think we have a pretty good question in the chat. So I'll just let you wrap this up and then I'll read it to you.
Yeah, that sounds perfect. Yeah, I'll get through this last conclusion. And I think there's might be a slide after this for questions. So, yeah, so if we don't get it right, if we don't account for all these factors, it's going to influence our soil health assessment results. And it's really going to limit our ability to assign meaning to the measurements that we get. And so one thing that I want to highlight is, like with the Valley project, just a little heads up, we don't see major differences in the soil properties. I'm just giving you a sneak peek of the results section. There weren't major differences between the good and poor management. And so we can say, okay, yeah, it's inconclusive. We didn't account for these factors. But if somebody else looks at the data that we present, they might say, well, this tells me that management doesn't matter and what NRCS is recommending isn't meaningful. Even though that's not true, it could be interpreted as that. So we really have to be careful when we're designing these projects and when we're presenting the results so that we can try to avoid that happening with what we have. So with that, I will take your question now. Alexander, if you wanted to read that.
Sure. And if Sharon, if you'd like to just unmute yourself, you can do that as well. But I think you're going to want to go back to the slide with the overall layer cake.
Yes, I can jump in. Can you all hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great, thanks. I've had issues with my sound. So this is actually a two-part question, the second part, which I didn't list, but just to quickly introduce myself, I'm currently with NRCS in the Soil and Plant Science Division, working on DSP guidance, and I'm new to this. I just started in October, and prior to that, I also participated in a dynamic soil properties for soil health project in Minnesota. So I really appreciate everything that you have put together today. And it would have been so good to see this when I started my project back in 2019. So first of all, thank you for this great presentation. But it seems incredibly difficult to find sites that fit all of these requirements, that have so many constants that are required to have a good project in such a dynamic and shifting and changing environment. And I'm wondering, the first question is, what would you say, in your experience, might be the most acceptable layer of the layer cake model to compromise if you can't find all of these conditions? And then the second part of my question is regarding relationship management and partnerships, because in my experience, as we were looking for a site, we found that people who were doing drastically different forms of management typically didn't want to be involved in a project where they would potentially be compared with their neighbor. So even though we were taking care to protect privacy and not share results or information without explicit permission, we found that people were really hesitant to be involved in a project like this if they felt like they were being pegged as being poor managers of their landscape, for example. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to, what do you think would be the most acceptable layer to compromise? And then how did you deal or not have to deal with that sort of relationship management, which also really limited our sites?
Yeah, those are really, really good questions. I'm glad that you're able to join us and bring perspective, especially since you've done these types of projects in the past. It's really valuable to hear your questions and to hear about some of the challenges that you guys had with your project too. So I'm actually going to take us out of the second question first, because I think that one, I feel like I have a very clear answer for that one. The second one, I might call on, Alexandra and Chris to give their input. But yeah, so the first question you asked was in terms of relationships and partnership, like trying to get these landowners to agree to have a team come out there and compare their soils to their neighbors. And so the thing that I want to highlight with this is that the main way that we found these sites, was we talked about a little bit before, was by going through the local field office and going through the DC there. And he already had, we were very fortunate because he already had relationships with all of the landowners and all of the farmers that we sampled and used as sites for this project. And so because he already had that existing relationship, that existing level of trust there, he could select sites and landowners to work with that he knew would probably be open to having you know, their soil, their sites, their management collected and compared. And I think the other thing to highlight is that Corey, you can chime in and talk about this too, but I think the other thing that Corey tried to highlight to them was like, hey, we're going to be doing the soil testing. We'll be able to hopefully present to you some information about your soils, your soil health, how you're doing, and then maybe recommend, if it was one of the sites that had poor soil health or was in our poor category, being able to share with them, the sites that had better soil health than yours, like what were they doing, and being able to share that with them. And so I think that aspect of just having that, utilizing those established relationships and connections that were already there, was the primary way that we avoided running into the obstacle that you were talking about. So I'll give Corey a chance, or Alexandra a chance to chime in, because I know they had a lot more of a role in this site selection process. So if you guys want to.
Lydia, you might not be able to see, but Corey had another meeting to go to, so he's not here, but I have a few things to say. Dave Harper, who's Virginia State soil scientist, he says, nature and soil properties is a continual universe of change. The realization of this, all that can be measured is a range of changes would be management differences, because no absolutes exist. What I meant to touch on when I was talking about, the original design, I had on my slide that helping farmers understand where they are on the soil health, what did I call it? A continuum, because we don't really know how bad can be, and we don't really know how good can be, right? So, through this process, kind of with talking to the landowners, we can at least kind of give you an idea. And then hopefully by implementing similar projects like this, we can kind of fill in all of the intermediates and eventually come up with, some sort of percentiles almost, you could say. But then in terms of finding sites, if Carl wants to comment, we can't all be Carl. Carl's just the best and the most personable of all of us. But I think Carl was just kind of driving up to farms and finding people where he's interested in sampling. Is that right, Carl?
Only here in Tidewater did I do that, because I knew the farmers, I knew the sites, and I knew where the soils were that I needed to look at. So I just concentrated on looking for producers that were managing on soils that I knew were well drained for what I was looking for. In the northern neck, I did just the opposite. I depended on the people up there to give me the names of people and to go talk to that they knew and see if their soils fit the pattern of what I was looking for. So I did two different ways, and fortunately, both of them have worked very well.
So this is Chris. Chris Lawrence. And Chris Seitz has been mentioned. Chris is a soil scientist. I'm an agronomist. And so when we talk about management history, that's kind of my specialty. But first, can you hear me, Alexandra? You guys?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I really love your questions that was asked, and I think, was it Sharon? I'm sorry if I didn't get your name right, but you asked two different questions, and Lydia hit the one on sites and on working with the relationship issues. And I think that's extraordinarily important, and so I really wanted to highlight a couple things. One thing we know is that when we work with folks like that know Corey, that work with Corey, there's a certain level of self-selection we have to recognize is inherent in that. In other words, if if we have someone, Corey, who knows and trusts Corey, they're probably not the worst manager around, because Corey's job is conservation. Do you see what I'm saying? And so I think we get into this, the reality is, if we want to find the real extremes of management, we have to dig deep, and we may have to run into the situation that you alluded to, where it's like, we're portraying your farm, it's like a moonscape pasture, right? Which is no cover. Those are the kind of extremes that are going to make our job easier, right? And showing the contrast. And how do you overcome that? It's going to take a lot of time. We can overcome everything if we have enough time. So Carl Peacock, for instance, is, I've had him driving around the eastern part of the state. He's putting in a huge amount of time to find out details of the fields that we're trying to select. But that pre-screening is very expensive in terms of time spent. If we're going to rely on someone like Corey, who knows a lot of farmers and has a tremendous amount of trust in the community, the more he knows about a farmer, probably the better the farmer is, just because, it's really the folks outside of our conservation community that are probably our best candidates for finding the degraded sites, right? So I think that's a really important point. While I have the floor, I wanted to go back, though, to your other point about this layer cake, right? And which factors do we think are going to be the most important? And I think what we're as an agronomist and someone sitting back and looking at this, I think the more recent the management, right? Logically, the more of an impact it would have. But like, you think about the depth thing. And this is something Alan, I think, can speak to. It's not only logical, but Alan Francis, which is probably tons of data to back this up. If you sample too deep for things like organic matter or biological activity change, you're going to mask everything. So we have to be. So which are most important? It's hard to say, but I think in terms of management, obviously the soil does have a long memory, but the nearer the management, probably the more important it is, which highlights this idea that Corey might know, right? Corey might know these guys extraordinarily well, but if he hasn't talked to them about what happened in the last 90 days, right? Then you can't just rely on your longer management, but your knowledge of the longer term. What I want to highlight is that you're hitting one of I think the key points. We have to be cautious about how much meaning we assign to these kinds of projects. And they may think about our project purpose. It may be that if you're going to try to mine past history to figure it may be that if you don't have the time to put in to figure out the different layers of the cake for each site, you may want to not assign as much meaning to the results. You may want to use them primarily for education, for demonstration. You see what I'm saying? So it goes back to project purpose. And we don't think it's a problem to overcome the layer cake. It's just, it goes back to find contrasting sites, very extreme contrasts. I put in enough time and make sure you're using the sites to answer the right questions. So the last thing I'll say, I'm thinking about what Mark Schoenbeck said. Is this whole design appropriate for assessing subtle differences in grazing management? Well, we would have, and that's why JB, who's probably on the call, and myself, we're the agronomists on the NRCS staff in Virginia. We do not want to assign meaning to these results, because I did not, it was my fault. I did not engage enough. I didn't have enough time to go out there and actually interview the farmers, dig in with the level of questions we needed to unpack the layer cake. That's not Corey's job. That's more my job. And without unpacking all that, we don't feel like we can assign enough meaning to the differences in treatments, right? The differences in management. So we don't want these relatively inconclusive numerical results from the lab to be misconstrued as the idea, well, it doesn't matter if you do rotational grazing versus continuous grazing, because we just don't know enough about the sites and the layer cake. So that's a long monologue, but any thoughts about that? Lisa brought up an interesting point, which is, did you get fence post data? And I assume what she's getting at here in the chat, right? She asked about fence post data. I think what she's getting at is, did you select some reference sites, right? Which would have been presumably untouched by grazing management. Excellent point. That should be part of every protocol. And again, it's something that I should have known and should have, if I'd spent the time dug into, is at every site, let's try to find a reference which has no animal impact and use that to benchmark what we're doing. Feedback.
Chris, I was just going to add to what you said by saying, like, just highlighting what it sounds like Dave and Shannon were maybe getting to, is that, it's kind of, and Alexandra too, that, it's, if you think that's you're going to be able to find sites where all of these factors match, like, it's pretty unrealistic, but just trying to match them the best that you can. And even if you can't match them perfectly, at least taking into account when you're looking at the results that, like, hey, these two sites, I see this big difference, but I also know that this was different about their management history, and just making sure that you're taking that into account when you're interpreting your results and looking at your data and trying to draw conclusions. Like, not that they all have to match perfectly, but at least that that you're accounting for that.
One thing too is, like, it was even just challenging trying to find the right soil map unit to be on. I mean, Frederick and Lodi, they're maps together, and then there's the rocky phase and all sorts of other things, just making sure where we wanted to be was a huge challenge. I would love to explore, maybe it's more important to map or to try to target like a certain topsoil texture, if like the parent material is the same. These are all things we have to try to figure out. And the folks in the DSP area with the soil and plant science divisions, I think we're going to have a heck of a time trying to get this protocol figured out completely in a way that might be just a little bit more well suited for agronomic systems. Because the thing with DSP is that we were really hamstrung and kind of had to sample to their protocol. And some things made sense, for a pasture system. Other things maybe made sense if you were doing a water table study, and all of this kind of falls into the DSP guide. So that was a major challenge, and Sharon has her hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and let her ask a question.
Thanks, Alexandra. The other thing that I just wanted to bring up as an additional complication, which I don't think we talk about enough in soil health research, is the erosion factor, right? And this goes along a little bit with topography, but also especially when we think about adding a reference site such as, a fence row or a nearby untouched pasture or whatever it might be that's your reference site. I know in my experience, we had, at least, I think it was probably about 15 centimeters at least of soil loss from our intensively cropped fields, right? And so I think that we conflate a lot of soil health differences that really might be a result of erosion more than anything else. So I just want to throw that out there and open that up to discussion if folks have thoughts on that.
I just want to say right away that Chris actually had put a good slide in the middle of this layer cake explanation. There were 2 slides that talked about that exact factor that you're talking about now. So I cut them out. So that's on me, because Chris did put them in there to talk about. So I just wanted to say that up front. But Chris, I'll let you expand on that.
What you're talking about, is excellent. And what you're pointing to is the importance of the long-term pass layer, right, in the cake, right? You can see the cake in front of you, because to lose that level of soil is more of a decades to centuries thing. And I'm not sure where you're located, but in the Piedmont and Valley region of Virginia, we've had 400 years. Well, a little in the Piedmont and the Valley less, but we've had 300 years to take the A horizon away. It's gone. And so, yeah, I mean, that long-term past is exactly the layer you're referring to. And That's it. It's just something you have to think about. We have to think beyond what happened in the last 10 years. It's as simple as that. And that takes time. And it takes putting the right person out there to work on that. I don't have any better explanation than that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered because it does have a big influence. So thanks for that comment and question, Sharon. Carl, I saw you unmute. Do you have or does anyone have any
I was just going to add that, it's when we talk about soils, we talk about arranging characteristics for the properties that they exist. And I think we need to take that same approach when we're looking at DSP. We're not going out there, we're not going to find exactly the same types of sites every time to compare and everything, because if we did, then we would probably be looking at maybe trying to get the same results. But I think what we should try to guide ourselves in is to try to find sites that are relatively similar enough that we feel like they can be compared, and then look at the range that we get with the analysis we derive from the sampling.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Carl. Good thing to keep in mind. So Mark has his hand up, so I'm going to let him ask his question or share his comment now.
Yeah, I already mentioned in the chat, and Alexandra, thank you, mentioned that this is something that the project is planning to take into account. But it seems to me that given all the complications of the layer cake design, another approach is to say, okay, on this farm, with its current and a near past and long-term past and its soil type, what happens when we switch to, let's say, moderate intensity continuous grazing to best management intensive rotational grazing with the same population, and then track soil organic carbon and other key soil health parameters, especially perhaps the biological activity index that Dr. Franz Lubers has been working on so extensively, or whatever, seems to be most appropriate, and just see how those change during a period of management intensive rotational grazing. And then on another farm, let's say it had been in rotational grazing and then it changed hands and the new farmer is now doing continuous grazing. And so the starting points may be very different, so that if you measure after 5 years, farm A versus farm B, you'll say, oh, well, the soil properties are similar, but whereas under the management and rotational grazing, you might see over 5 years, it has come up from a somewhat compromised degree of soil health to really good. And the one that went from rotational to continuous, maybe it went from superb to slightly less good, and they look the same comparing to each other. But if you look at the 5-year trends, you see the difference. Okay, thanks.
So this is Chris Lawrence. I mean, you guys are asking wonderful, wonderful questions. I think it goes back to all your questions are recognizing just how they're trade-offs, but it comes back to, if your treatments are based on what a farmer did in the past, how absolutely important it is to spend a lot of time getting that information. And that's, we look at the benchmark study up in Pennsylvania and Maryland, right? There's a huge amount of effort these guys put in just to document what the farmer did last year. And so it's a time issue, and there has to be time devoted to figuring that out. I do think, we have had such great discussion. Believe it or not, there's even better stuff to come in the slides. So I'm proposing that we shift back to Lydia. Technically, we have 12 minutes before the end of this. And Lydia, I'm not saying you should try to fire through absolutely everything, but it'd be nice, at least, I think, to give people a sense of some of the other lessons, and especially lesson 5, right? Which is another one that we feel like we have a lot to learn from. So with that, maybe take back the mic and go for it.